Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we're going to talk about housing, specifically what needs to happen to ensure that the construction sector is set to meet the new government's ambitious target of building 1.5 million new homes over the next 5 years. Now, there's no question that when we look back at past performance of house building in the UK, we've got some way to go to meet this 300,000 plus new homes target each year. The reality is that new house building numbers have rarely nudged over 200,000 a year in the last 40 years. But there are signs that the new government wants this to change, and the recent announcement by Deputy Prime Minister Rayner on planning and housing targets underlined a clear ambition to challenge and support local authorities to meet this target. But as many have already pointed out, there is no silver bullet to solving the housing crisis. And when it comes to delivering on these housing targets, the nation and the construction industry still faces a rake of challenges beyond removing the planning obstacles that the government has initially and probably rightly targeted. And with this week seeing the publication of the long-awaited More BIC report into the 2017 Grenfell fire, which will be another sobering moment for construction. Of course, we've been talking about these challenges for literally decades, not least the need to find and retain the right skills to do the job, but we now have a new government and a new imperative that perhaps will finally turn the dial and transform the sector into a shape capable of meeting the ambitious but nevertheless vital targets set by Labour. So, let's hear more. My guest today is Mark Farmer, founder and chief executive of Cast Consultancy, and a font of knowledge when it comes to accelerating construction's performance and specifically the challenges of kickstarting the nation's lacklustre house building performance. Mark, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you for inviting me on.
Great, it was good to have you here. Many of the issues, Mark, that I referenced in the intro were, of course, raised and addressed by the Farmer Review in 2016, your seminal report into the construction sector and the need to create a strategy for modernised and sustainable construction industry. And we're going to talk through a bit about the specifics of your report a bit later on, but 1.5 million homes built in 5 years, is that achievable?
So I'll probably start, as I mean to go on, by being fairly blunt. And the reality is, in my view, that it's not achievable. It's a soundbite. It's a political soundbite. I can understand the need to give political direction and to give aspiration and hope, but the reality is we're just not in the right place to get anywhere near 300,000 homes a year. If you look at our start position, we're actually shrinking. There was stats just out week or two ago saying, based on new starts in the last quarter, we're running at 120,000 homes a year. So there's just no way in the world you immediately flip from a position of building 120,000 to 300,000 homes, which you'd have to do. Otherwise, you start building up a backlog as to how you get to 1.5 million homes over 5 years. So the reality is that the momentum isn't right, and actually there's much broader issues in terms of the need for structural reform in the market, which perhaps we'll talk about in a second. That just means that is not a viable proposition.
So even the government talks about bold plans to slash red tape, a new homes accelerator. There isn't. Well, is there anything really new in these plans?
Not really. I think, ultimately you do need political leadership. You do need a point of view as to how you're going to start attacking the issues. And there are so many issues that need to be addressed head on that, we can't have a vacuum here. We need to have some thought leadership and some thinking as to how we're going to start addressing things. But the reality is they're all variations on a theme. What you hear from one administration to another, there's nothing that's massively radical. Certainly, I haven't heard anything in my time in the industry that I've all of a sudden thought, well, where did that come from? That's completely super radical.
But thinking positively, Mark, clearly the government has chosen to focus on planning reform and the need to accelerate local authority housing decision-making in the first instance, to speed up to this 300,000 homes and 200 sites. Is that, for you, the right place to start?
Again, just coming back to the complexity of the issues here and having lived and breathed this market for the best part of 20, 25 years, the reality is there's no one good place to start. You have to actually be addressing a whole series of different things parallel. Because actually, if you just start in one place and focus on that and spend effort there and leave the other things, you're going to hit the buffers again. And I think, part of the bigger problem here is that we are facing a broken system, and it's a system-wide issue that spans land, The land market and the pricing of land is a
Right.
huge issue, which I don't think is addressed enough because it is hyper political sensitive. The planning system, definitely, yes. So I'm not saying the government's wrong to be focusing on that at this stage. And, there are things that can be done in policy terms to address that. And there's also issues around production capacity, because if we sort out land and you sort out planning, but you still got a construction market that's not sized or capable of delivering that quantum of housing output, you're going to hit the buffers there as well. So the reality is we need a multifaceted approach. If you ask me where the most important area is for an intervention, it's actually the land market. And I just feel so many of the problems we have around affordability are driven by what is a dysfunctional land market, which means that the highest bidder wins. That gets translated into either rents or to sale prices. And this massive divide we currently have in affordability is down to the fact that in most land deals or in most housing deals, 40% of the whole value is the land that the building sits on.
Yeah, which is interesting because, obviously, Angela Rayner's talking about a pragmatic approach to planning is one solution. You, in 2019, were a champion for modern methods of construction in house building to try to bring in new innovation into the sector. But, are you saying, therefore, that unless we get land sorted out, then all these other bits are kind of like fiddling around at the edges?
Well, no, I think that the problem is that everything is interconnected. I'd say land is the most difficult one to address because actually it's politically sensitive, because actually the idea of trying to suppress land values has much bigger implications, not only to current land owners who might withdraw their land from the market. And there's one big issue that's floating around in terms of the current government's proposals. And you might have heard that they're even talking about the term compulsory purchase orders, CPOs, which is a fairly radical term that lots of people take fright of, and quite rightly. But actually, we do need some bold thinking as to how we drive, if we want sub-market housing. And the problem in this country is we do not build enough affordable homes with a small a in the right locations where people want to live. And if we don't resolve that, and that needs the land market to be addressed, then actually modern methods of construction, planning reform, they all become secondary issues. So actually, we just need we need a strategy which addresses all the things that are wrong with the market concurrently, as opposed to going off racing ahead on one particular theme only.
Which just, again, brings us back to your farmer review 8 years ago, because the reality, Mark, is that you raised a lot of these issues back then. You talked about, current government-funded demand-side stimuli for house building, measures to ease the planning system, and public land supply initiatives, should all better influence the construction process. So are you disappointed with what transpired following that huge amount of work you did and a huge amount of stakeholders you got on board for that bit of work?
Yes and no is probably the simple answer to that. I was not disappointed in the sense that government reacted. So on the back of that report in 2016, the housing white paper in 2017, and then the subsequent industrial strategy and the transforming construction programme that came out in 2018, my direct or indirect influence in that, and I can't tell you, what happened behind closed doors because I don't know, but I'd like to think my report sort of played a role in trying to drive political awareness that we had a major issue. We had a problem with the industry that was going to prevent the level of house building that was required, the level of economic infrastructure and social infrastructure delivery that the country required. So I think political awareness grew quite rapidly, and policy started to emanate out of that, both in the Affordable Homes Programme that came out in 2020, but also on the back of the presumption in favour of MC for Treasury funded projects. Yep. All of that was a big tick in the box for me, and I felt quite proud in having played a role. Where I'm less happy and, to be honest, I am disappointed is the fact that a lot of that has now been unravelled through the simple act of a economic recession having taken place post 2022 and a deep housing market correction that has actually meant the demand side that the industry is so reliant on when it's looking to change and it's looking to actually invest in doing things differently has been completely ripped away. And actually, in fairness, the government's had lots to deal with around the pandemic and global conflict and all sorts of stuff. But the reality is, if you're going to change an industry like construction, you need to have a long-term strategy as far as you can in a political cycle. You need to have a steady hand and not sort of start scattergunning at the nearest sign of problems. And you need to think about how you're going to drive change in a steady manner and not be allow the industry to be exposed to high economic cyclicality, which is exactly what's happened, unfortunately, and has led to so much progress in the last 18 months, 2 years, unraveling the point we got to previously.
Yeah, and I suppose you weren't the only one that was producing reports. I mentioned the More Bit report this week, but of course Dame Judith Hackett's initial report into building standards and fire safety really highlighted what you might describe as a truly dysfunctional industry, which perhaps valued low cost and speed over quality and safety. Are we just simply not learning as an industry, or is it just the backdrop which is not allowing us to learn as an industry?
It's the latter. I'm quite sanguine on a lot of this stuff now. I'm probably more so than I was 9 years ago, when I first got into this whole world of trying to campaign for industry reform.
You're less of an angry man now.
Yeah, and I think it's been an education to an extent of the fact that however much energy you have to try and vocalize the need to change, what's coming, what the alternative is of oblivion in some instances, or really difficult industry, what we've got to recognize is that the industry works in a certain way for a reason. And it works in a certain way because it's formed itself into this sort of survivalist, was the term I think I used back in 2016. It's all about flexibility. It's all about not holding fixed costs. It's all about the subcontracting model. It's about self-employed labor. It's about cheapest price wins. It's about, if you can cut a corner, potentially that's the way that you do things. And
all points that Judith Hackett, of course, raised as a hugely contributory.
And that's the overlap between my world and what came out in relation to the Building Safety Act, which is the statutory sort of fallout from the Hackett work. For me, and having more recently been involved in reviewing the industry training boards, where skills and training has been a really front and foremost theme in my thinking for the last 18 months or so, it's quite clear this competency issue, which is talked about a lot, goes to the heart of a lot of the problems we have in the industry. And competency, everyone thinks, that's the competency of a bricklayer or cladding fixer on site. It's actually not. It's about the competency of a client. It's about the competency of the advisors, the consultant advisors to that client. It's the competency of the contractor management team. And ultimately, yes, it is the competency of the installer on site. But that chain of custody of responsibility and the problems we have in the industry around lack of competency, if I'm quite frank, have actually ultimately transpired into the safety issues that were reflected in the Grenfell disaster.
Because one of the other points you made in the Farmer Review, of course, the industry and its clients, usually have non-aligned interests reinforced by traditional procurement protocols and deep-seated cultural resistances to change. And that goes to this competency issue around the competency of being able to procure properly. You spent a lot of time trying to change this. I mean, are we getting there?
Very slowly, in my opinion. I think one of the areas I'm disappointed by is that I would have expected a lot more public sector leadership of this debate on procurement. So we had the construction playbook, a big fanfare around this is how we're going to change the way that we buy public works. It hasn't, in my opinion, and what I hear, and I don't do a lot of public sector work in my own business life, but I hear a lot of anecdotal evidence that it's not landed. It's not being used routinely by public departments. It's certainly not being used in local authorities or in housing association world. So actually part of the issue here is education. It's education of the procurers that exist. And that's where the IPA's program for what they're trying to do in reforming construction procurement, intelligence and education is so important. It just needs to be sped up. We're talking about this, and 8 years on from my report, we had the construction playbook, however many years ago. We seem to be wading through treacle.
Well, it's 30 years since Latham, and we haven't even mentioned that. We're not short of documents which tell us which way to go. But another issue, of course, that all of these documents talk about is it's research and development, investment in innovation. But we still seem to lack the either imperative or the ability, or I suppose the resources to actually step up and invest in that innovation. What has to happen, to get that to change?
Look, I think there is from a positive angle for a change in terms of the bluntness of my speaking, and I don't apologise for that, by the way. I'm giving you a candid, honest perspective on what's been going on. But on a positive, when it comes to R&D, the Transforming Construction programme that came out of the Industrial Sector Challenge Fund in 2018, the fact that construction benefited from that, I think was good. I hear that the new government wants to reenact an industrial strategy, which I think would be a good thing. I think getting rid of the industrial strategy approach was a mistake. We need industrial sector specific approaches to R&D, to skills and training, to productivity, wider productivity challenges, which construction has a major challenge. One of the drivers I think going to be really interesting over the coming period is the fact that labour scarcity, which unfortunately is going to become a greater and greater overbearing pressure on the industry as we move forward, is going to change the pricing dynamics of site labour. So we're going to get to a point where the cost of site labour is going to keep going up. It's going to inflate. It will not be paid for by productivity. So actually business-led decisions, rather than government forcing change, businesses are going to work out for themselves that actually they're going to be forced to have to look at different approaches that reduce reliance on site labour. What's really going to change R&D is the commercial imperative that businesses have no choice but to do it. As long as it's seen as sort of something that's a nice to have, it won't happen. It has to be business critical.
Because ominously, I suppose you said back in 2016 that in the post-Brexit days, we could see a 20 to 25% decline in the available labour force within a decade. And I suppose what you're saying is that is actually coming to be a reality.
It's happened. You look at the figures, it's already happened. It's happened much quicker than I anticipated. And I have to say the labour force size quantum skills alignment is the biggest issue. Having, again, just looked at the industry training boards and looking at the construction labour force in particular, it worries me immensely, more so than even 2016 when I wrote Modernise or Die. Look at the facts. So in pre-global financial crisis in 2008, we had nearly 2.6 million construction workers in this country. As of the last quarter, we've just got over 2 million, slightly over 2 million.
Yeah.
That's 25% reduction. And it's only 8 years since Modernise or Die. So you think about what the reliance we have on artisan trades and the fact that we already have an average age of 40-something, 40, 45. As the more that goes to the right-hand side, the more unstable the structural stability and resilience of the industry becomes. And I think we all have to reflect on that. But we can't ignore those kind of statistics.
Yeah. Well, getting into the UK housing challenge, I mean, one of the things you said about government back in 2016 is that it has a strategic choice to make about the future role of grant-funded social housing, which historically has been used as, as you said, a counter-cyclical demand tool. I mean, how do you reflect on this statement? Should the new government take steps to reignite social housing?
Yes, 100%. I think it is one of the really big areas of focus for an incoming government around land planning, production. There's implicitly in all of this, there is a big thing about what kind of housing we're building. What's the affordability of that home building relative to the population that wants to and needs to live there, where the jobs are, etc. And the lack of sub-market housing in this country that's accumulated over 30, 40 years is at the heart of so many of the structural problems we now have. And unfortunately, my call in 2016 for a counter-cyclical approach to using social and affordable housing as a counter-cyclical tool has not transpired. In fact, I'd say the opposite has happened. What you've got is now a complete synchronized housing market downturn where the affordable housing sector, particularly the housing association-led sector, is stopping building. It's withdrawing from Section 106 agreements. It has construction cost viability issues. It has cladding remediation legacy issues. It has mould and building quality issues. All of that means that affordable homes are being deliveries going down as much as private for sale. We need that reversed. We need government to come up with a social housing programme, and it needs to be a programme, not a series of projects, that actually then drives a demand stimulus that then can drive reform in how we build, going back to modernisation, etc., etc.
Because 40 years ago, when there was a huge amount of local authority money being spent on housing. The term affordable housing, it didn't mean 80% market value. It meant an awful lot less than 80% market value. Do we need to sort of, to get back to that proper definition or a new definition of what affordable is?
I think we need a spectrum of products that really span what was true, deeply discounted social housing in the old terminology through to what is now the sort of 80% open market sale, open market rent terminology. And actually we need everything in between. We have a spectrum of affordability challenges. Shared ownership sits in there somewhere, but it needs to be accompanied by other new innovative tenure models. I think the problem we also have is that there's no money in the public purse to increase subsidy. So what you've got, going back to why we have a synchronized downturn, is most of the housing associations have been forced to become developers to prop up their core social purpose and to cross-subsidize the grant or lack of grant. We need to move away from that. We have to have a different model with more financial capacity, because when we talk about land, planning, construction, the other bit that is part of this debate is the money, the finance. So what is the financial model that underpins this? In my view, it has to, and there's an inevitability, it will need to include private capital. It will need to be institutional, probably patient, long-term pension capital. It needs to be injected into the sector such that if we're not just reliant on the public purse, but we're not actually employing a model that's about maximising development profit return, because the model won't work.
Yeah. You did also say back then that more tenure diversity, as you just pointed out, would immediately imply different supply chain and delivery models that may promote innovation. But you also said, and it's probably come to pass, that large-scale innovation is unlikely that will start in the volume house builder market. I mean, how do we get around the fact that the industry is dominated by a small number of large volume house builders?
I don't think we get around it or get away from it. I think we accept it. It's part of the structure of the market. And again, going back to reality check, we can theorise about, having thousands of SMEs re-enter the market. And I think we should definitely have an ambition for diversification. We do need more SMEs. It's not as simple as just saying that, though. To get what are the things that are going to get SMEs back in the market. In reality, going back to the planning reforms that have been announced, one of the positives out of that is that if you de-risk planning, if you make it more formulaic, if you actually decrease the complexity, because at the moment, running a planning application for a 100-unit scheme is probably the same as if it's a 1,000-unit scheme. So actually, what you need to have is something where the burden of planning, which is for SMEs disproportionate, is eased. Financing, access to financing is improved so you can get more diversity. But these SMEs aren't sitting there on coat hangers ready to go.
No.
They don't exist.
No, we did see some new players coming in around the modular house building market, and of course, you talked about that there may well be an additional 50,000 homes a year coming out of the pre-manufactured housing industry, in addition to the 160,000 that were happening back then. The reality is that it hasn't happened. People haven't been able to get into the market, or they've tried and they've failed. Could it still happen though? Could we still get these pre-manufactured companies coming in?
I think what's clear is the single-family housing volumetric modular market. That's a bit of a mouthful, but if you look at that very specific strand of activity where you had your Legal and Generals, you had your Ilka Homes, very high-profile names and very high-profile failures, to be quite frank, I think there is it's going to be a real uphill struggle to get back to a point where you can repeat that kind of attempt to create additionality, because that's what it was trying to do. It was actually saying, we're not just manufacturers, we're house builders. We're going to come in, we're not going to cannibalise the labour force that your traditional house builders are using. We're going to have an additional capacity because we're doing it completely off-site. The fact is that the housing market downturn has completely derailed that approach. I think confidence in the economic model and the resilience, how do you build resilience in the model where you invest in tens of millions of pounds, where actually all you need is another trust budget and you completely take the skids from underneath it. So I think people are going to be wary now. So I think pre-manufacturing is going to adopt a different it's going to look different. I think you're going to see much more hybrid construction. In fairness to the volume house builders, where I said that there wouldn't be a mass reform, we are actually seeing a steady move towards high pre-manufactured value. Most of them now, because of the Future Home Standard and the labour scarcity risks, are actively accepting the role of things like timber framing. They're looking at high performance envelope solutions. They're looking at ways in which they can reduce their labour on site through a combination of different approaches. So I wouldn't beat up on the house builders. We just need to have a more diverse market with economic models that allow us to do that. But first and foremost, the government needs to set the mood music in the background that our housing market isn't going up and down like a fiddler's elbow.
Yeah. Let's find a bit more about you, Mark, and what you're up to now. You're a quantity surveyor by background, having studied back in the day at Kingston University, and you had what is a rare thing now, a 26-year career with a single business, in your case, E.C. Harris. I mean, QSing, it's not everyone's cup of tea. What attracted you to becoming a QS?
Yeah, look, it was an interesting story, I suppose. So when I was doing my A-levels, I was fairly intent on becoming a civil engineer. And one of the reasons I'm in construction, by the way, which I think is a really salient point, is my dad was in the industry. He's a stonemason. Right. So actually that family influence, which I think is such a huge draw of, having either parents or siblings in the industry, that was me. So I was talking to the chief estimator at where my dad worked when I was doing my A-levels, and I was thinking about university courses, etc. And he said, look, if you want to get on in this industry, you need to be close to the money. Whether it was right or wrong, who knows? But I made that choice. I've had a fantastic career. My time at E.C. Harris was absolutely fantastic over the course of 25 plus years, going from undergrad, working in civil engineering. I worked on the Channel Tunnel. I worked on the Jubilee Line extension. I worked throughout the commercial and residential world. I worked all over the globe as well. So it was a huge bit of my life, and I've got no regrets about staying there so long. As you say, it's a rare thing now to have that sort of single career.
Absolutely. I mean, E.C. Harris was acquired by Arcadis, of course, in 2011, and they dropped the name in 2015, just before you left to form your own consultancy, Cast. I mean, on reflection, what are the pros and cons of being absorbed by such a large business?
Yeah, I think the world of M&A is always fraught with issues, particularly in people-based consultancy. So we're not selling widgets. We're doing things with people and IP and knowledge. So you have to respect the fact it's quite an emotive process. I've got no issues at all with Arcadis. Our Cast have subsequently collaborated extensively with Arcadis on various things. So I'm out the other side of that. But at the time, there was quite an emotive link from me back to E.C. Harris. My first mentor back in 1989 when I joined the business was Norman Harris, who was the son of E.C. Harris. So family link was still there. It was very much, it was probably more old school chartered surveyor type world then. It's moved on a lot, but for me, I just felt different, and I just felt there was an itch I needed to scratch, and hence the whole thing about setting up Cast.
Well, just talk about Cast. I mean, it's a real estate and construction consultancy focused on driving sustainable change in the development of and the construction industry. What sort of things do you get up to? You mentioned you work with Arcadis, but what's the sort of typical project? Yeah, so
we're relatively unique in that, yes, we do project work. So it's ostensibly the bulk of what we do is project management, contract administration, cost management, but we also do advisory. Where we're advising all sorts of different businesses. So most of our clients are developers and investors. We work a lot, primarily in the residential sector, but not exclusively. So we work for big build-to-rent investors. We work for student accommodation developers. We work for later living and senior living specialists. But we also, in our advisory capacity, we're working in supply chain. So we're quite unique in that we're advising clients and developers, but we're also advising suppliers, subcontractors, manufacturers, everyone that's downstream, if you like, in that value chain. Because part of what we're doing is building on the modernise or die theme, which, in the same year I published that report, I set Cast up. So it seemed a missed opportunity not to try and influence from my own, putting skin in the game for my own business, and trying to drive change. And that's led us to do some really interesting work across the piece and internationally as well, including for governments. So working as far afield as New Zealand and Australia, Canada, Middle East, we're really proud of the brand we've built and the reputation we've built.
And you've done a lot of work on modular house building, and perhaps we'll chat a bit more about that at the moment. But I see you did some work or did a video with Kevin McLeod of Grand Designs discussing the potential of modular. I mean, clearly he brings this issue to a wider audience. I mean, is there a prefab, to use a phrase, branding problem to overcome?
I'm not convinced, actually. I think a lot of people talk about this prefab moniker and how it actually acts as a real sort of millstone around the neck of reform. There's definitely people of a certain age that will equate prefab to post-war poor quality homes, emergency homes, if you like. But actually, my view on the public perception, particularly the younger generation, is the idea of a quite snazzy, contemporary, factory-built home. You know, you take the Hofhaus German concept, where that Hofhaus in Germany is seen as premium. You actually, if you have a Hofhaus, you can command more of a resale value than a traditionally built home. I just feel there's more potential for that with the younger generation who like the idea of digital manufacturing, like the idea of quality assurance. They are really circumspect about the idea of actually, building a home in a muddy field with a bunch of people that have come together for the first time and then go off again. So I think Kevin's profile, the same with George Clark, who I also know very well. I'm a trustee of his charity Moby. So both are big TV personalities and both architects who get the idea of modernisation, understand its place, understand the value and the quality that can be driven from it. We definitely need more mainstream media attention to what modular and what modern methods of construction more generally can represent in today's world.
Mark, you're super busy, and I noticed that you've your youngest daughter, I think, has just finished at university. So presumably you've got a lot more time on your hands nowadays. What do you get up to when you're not at work?
Well, I'd like to think I'll have a bit more time. I'm not sure whether that's the reality or not. But look, I enjoy various things. I like travelling. I've just got back from a really interesting week in Canada and the US. My wife and I like to travel a lot. I read as much as I can. Nothing to do with construction and property. I just try and broaden my interest through reading. I was born and brought up in London, so I am mad into country pursuits. I sort of about pushing back against my roots. I like the idea of going out and fishing and walking. I do a lot of walking. So there's a variety of things that I have that keep me busy when I have that time away from work.
Good. Well, long may you get plenty of time away from work, but I get the impression that you're a bit of a workaholic. But anyway, let's talk a bit more about the government's role in driving change. There's we talked about the overhaul of the planning system, but one of the things that they do talk about is to have a new system to ensure, and the phrase they use, every area must have a local housing plans with government ready to take the tough decisions to step in if areas fall off track. Who are the planning experts that they talk about that will be deployed to resolve these planning issues? Do you know who they are?
No. You tell me. No, I think there was a lot of debate about lack of resource in planning. There's been some funding. I have to say the level of funding doesn't really touch the sides around what's needed. I actually don't think there's a problem with new planning talent coming into the industry. There's lots of planning graduates. Actually, I know of planning grads that have struggled to get a job, which goes back to this point of, the cyclicality in our industry. So there's no shortage of pipeline of new planning professionals coming in. The problem is experienced senior planners that are needed to make some really tough decisions around driving municipal planning reform. That's the bit that's in short supply. We have a democratic planning system in the UK at the moment, so it's different in some respects to what you see in the US and parts of Australia, where it's much more rules-based. I think we need more rules-based planning. I think we need more codification of what can be done and what can't. I think you do need some democratic protections around locals being able to vote on certain things, but it needs to be ring-fenced. And I think the more you streamline the process to make it more rules-based, the more burden you take away from planning officers to make to give subjective guidance, because it becomes formulaic.
Right, yeah.
So I think I'm not sure. We're back to a resource challenge of senior, competent people that are able to deliver the scale of change that we need in the industry. And, that is easier said than done.
So just to finally wrap up, Mark, what's your advice for Angela Rayner?
Listen to this podcast. Everything that we've gone through, particularly my points about do not just focus on planning. Think about this as a multifaceted problem. Think about land. Be bold, but I have to say, in fairness, watch out for unintended consequences. Think about the role of public land. We heard just a week or two ago the Ministry of Defence is sitting on tens of thousands of undeveloped residential plots. Why? Government needs to get busy actually using the assets it has that don't necessarily cost money to drive new solutions. Listen to industry, listen to innovators who have got good ideas, listen to the money that actually comes up with sustainable long-term solutions, and think about that social housing reboot that we talked about in a way that creates a more diverse and affordable housing market. And actually, if you do all of that, guess what? We might have the ability to reform how we build stuff and modernise construction as well, because we'll have demand for what we do.
Brilliant. Mark, I do hope she does listen to this podcast and takes on board all those messages. But thanks so much for joining me. Huge challenges ahead, but as you say, huge opportunities for the sector to really move the dial in terms of creating change, boosting productivity. So thanks for sharing your ideas, and thanks for joining me today on the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thank you, Anthony. My pleasure.
Many thanks. Sadly, that's all we've got time for today, but we have more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline and more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website. That's www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background links to some of the issues discussed today and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Mark, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.